We are looking at Psalm 19 today. We're going to look at the whole passage. So let me conclude with this. The last verse of this passage. May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, my Lord, my rock, and my Redeemer. That is, in fact, the end of this passage. And it's the whole point of why this psalm was written down. So let me just repeat it once. May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing to your sight, Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. So please keep this thought in the foremost of your mind as we're going to study this today and look at it. It tells us what David's motivation is in writing. It's a pouring out of his heart to the Lord. And as you can see from what he says, it's hopes of pleasing him and actually being a blessing to him. It's a song written to God. Now, an interesting thing about this psalm is that no one else is mentioned, as you notice. There's no advice to others. There's no admonition to the nation. Verse 11 says, by them your servant is warned, not your servants are warned. If you look at the book of Proverbs or the book of Ecclesiastes, it's all about advice. You should consider doing this and you should consider avoiding that. And you'll notice that there are many psalms that seem very, very personal in the book of Psalms, that seem to be the author, in this case David, very much alone with the Lord, speaking to him, and David is worshiping him. But of course there's a wider purpose, because if you notice in some of the Bibles you're going to read, it says at the beginning, for the choir director. So this song is meant to be, this very personal song is meant to be for everyone. It's going to be sung out loud in the temple. So how come, if it's so personal, is he reading it out like that? His goal in this, David's, is to get you to know how he got to the point of that final statement and how you can get there as well. Okay, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart, and that's what we're going to follow today. We're going to follow David's roadmap that he lays out to get an understanding of God that sort of jumps the boundaries of our heart and spills out of our mouths and into the world. So we mentioned that this psalm is a worship and even an offering to the Lord. Right? But what does it mean exactly to worship? And if you're going to break it down in a simple way, maybe you could say that it means to look at someone or something in odd cases as entirely superior and better than anything else, such that you feel compelled to bow down before it and really blurt out how you feel. And I think that's what true worship is in the truest sense. Now, there are some things that are called worship that aren't, in fact, worship. A poet talking about someone they're in love with, they might use the term worship. They worship that person. There's also a religious sense of worship where you say, a religious person might say they're worshiping their God in hopes of getting what they can out of that God. Right? When deep down, they don't adore them. They don't really trust them even. Right? It's sort of like, these old things you hear about of, they're throwing a virgin into a volcano so they can get the storm god to come and rain on them. That is not worship. That's just the barest obedience. A true component of worship is adoration. Right? And this psalm is a psalm of worship and of adoration. This psalm of David, he's going to tell us what causes him to worship and the effect of that on his life. Okay, the cause, the something that makes him bow down and worship the Lord, and the impact on him also. Okay, now when I was in my later teens, which was really a long time ago, I asked my oldest brother if I could borrow his 2-volume set of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. These were like big bricks, big books, very heavy. But I had heard the Bible study teachers talking about them or quoting from them, and some things that they had learned from this work. Right? And it was sort of meant, when it was written in the 16th century, as a one-stop shopping of theology. It was like everything was in there. So, and you couldn't keep it on the shelves at the time. It was so popular. Every Christian was reading this. to the extent that they were hounding Calvin all his life to constantly come out with new editions and add more to it and add more to change it. So for hundreds of years, this was very popular. So there I was. I wanted to read this. I was not a person who read giant books. But I opened it up, and it said, Chapter 1, The Knowledge of God the Creator. Ooh. Now, to a young person, what was in this book was like a skyscraper to me. Okay, it was very, very tall. It seemed to tower over me, and it seemed totally impenetrable. The idea of reading like a giant book of calculus. I'm very bad at math also, I should mention that. But I started to read it, and it was like I learned something right away. I learned that God is great, not because of the things he did for me primarily, but because he's great. So it pointed me directly into the Old Testament, which I had rarely looked at as a young person. The Old Testament was very mysterious to me. But this really plunged me into it, and it showed me the Lord's majesty. Something as a young Christian I did not understand. And I found that the Lord is great and amazing and astonishing and astounding and bewildering. You notice this is in alphabetical order. Breathtaking, extraordinary, marvelous, spectacular, stunning, and wonderful. Right? And when you think of the wisest in the world, in the universe, it's him. When you think of the most intelligent, it's him. When you think of the most creative, the most far-sighted, the most compassionate, and the most loving, the most everything we respect to the highest degree, he's there at the pinnacle, at the very, very top. Everything else is less than him. And it's not slightly less, it's way down the list, right? The margin is to the next contestant is, shall we say, far. Yet at the same time, I learned that the Lord made us great enough in his image to be able to understand him and see what he is and to enjoy him. The greatest that humanity turns out usually tends to be a bit of an embarrassment. When you look at people's lives and their thoughts closely, it doesn't matter who it is, the great and the mighty and the powerful, they are at some point, you're going to find an embarrassment. But not so with God. So I'm thankful for these 2 volumes in that they pointed me to the Scripture and they pointed me to the heart of God, and it taught me to worship his majesty, something I did not understand. I still have those books on my shelf. I never gave them back. I never will give them back. A few years later, I went on another little reading binge and decided to read The Republic by Plato, the Greek philosopher, which was sort of his view of the perfect society. And I got quite the jolt out of it. You know, I started reading it and I thought, this is cool. I'm thinking things I never thought before. But after a few months of reviewing it, I started to realize it was mostly nonsense. Right? And the jolt I got of it was really me thinking, you know what, I'm smarter than everybody else because I can read Plato. Right? Because I was young and I was stupid back then. And I'm slightly less stupid now. But it didn't stay with me because there was no truth in it. There was no majesty in that book at all. So David is going to actually read from 2 books in this passage also, but neither of them will be bad. They're both very good. They're both majestic, right? One of them is the book of nature. The other one is the Torah, or the law of God, okay, what we call the Bible. So now, in a world where there was no light pollution, everyone looked at the heavens every night. You couldn't help it, right? You could see all the stars and constellations from wherever you were. Office work did exist back then, but there wasn't much of it. And you spent a lot of time outside and influenced by nature around you, right? There were no cars with radios or phones with playlists to distract you. So when you moved about, you had time to observe and a little time even to think, right? How often do you look up at the sky during the day or night? Or when you're going out in your average day, look at the streams or the fields or the forests. We don't really do that. Nature has become kind of a backdrop for people's Instagram photos. Right? They go and they see this vista, and it's like they put themselves in the picture, and the picture's not really about nature. It's about them. Right? I think we're all guilty of that to a certain point. But that's not the case with David. We're kind of more interested in things made with human hands, and we're getting used to getting access to things very quickly. With David, he was a shepherd when he was younger. Right? So in his young life, this is something he experienced, was the outdoors. He had the exact opposite. There was not a lot of people in view. There was no one to get distracted by, and a lot of time to spend looking at creation. So if you notice the scenic routes around the city, right? There's like Gwen Boulevard, some parts of it, and there's Lakeshore. They're empty, right? There's very few cars on them. Why is that? Because everybody wants to get where they're going as fast as they can. We don't really have a lot of time to spend just slowing down and looking at things. So David looked at the heavens, and he says, they declared the glory of the Lord, his majesty, his perfection, the work of his hands, the mind behind everything that there is or will be. And he says in verses 2-4, day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. So what David is saying here is nature won't shut up about the glory of God. Both day and night, all day and all night, even though there's no audible words, you can record the truth of what they're saying is unmistakable to everyone. Right? Not only is there a maker, but he's a glorious maker. Right? And he far exceeds the expectations that David could ever have had of existence. But then we ask the question, isn't David just an ignorant shepherd in a small country in the middle of nowhere trying to make sense of what he doesn't understand? Now, this was written 2,700 years before the modern scientific revolution in, let's say, the 17th century. So it's long before. But strangely enough, it's some things you don't hear about often, that African nomads used the motions of the stars to create calendars about 4,000 years before David. Right? For agricultural purposes, they charted them. Right? Star charts and astronomical observations showed the regularity of all these items in the skies. Right? And it goes back to well before David. There are ancient stone monuments everywhere, charting calendars, looking at the stars. Right? Stonehenge is a famous one you might have heard. That's about 2,000 years before David. Right? So, being a king also, David would be rubbing shoulders with the scientific community of his time. He'd be talking to people about these things. So it's important not to forget that science isn't new. The scientific revolution came about really thanks to the printing press. We had the printing press around the 15th century, and that enabled ideas to be printed and shipped all over the place. So instead of relying on one person writing a handwritten manuscript and then taking it from Geneva and traveling to, somewhere in Germany and talking to somebody about it, you could print this and send it to every single school and university at the time. You could send it to thinkers everywhere. And all that multiplied the knowledge and enabled scientific knowledge to suddenly speed up. Right? It was all available. But the printing press was only in the 15th century. It's not that long ago. So that enabled minds to come together. So the truth of science is that it's not new. It's in fact very old. You'll notice David doesn't say that the stars are gods or that the sun is God. To him, they are things. They're objects, just like we look at them now. The postmodern period, the post-scientific period. Well, you know what I'm saying. After 1700. So like us, David is looking at this and saying, these are things. I watched them. They are things. The sun even is a thing. And about 25 years ago, I had a friend I was working with, and he said, I want you to understand more about, nature and science and all that. And he handed me this book. And in that book, it talked about, in the preface of it, it said there's complexity to nature, an incredible complexity. And it said that, it has astounding laws, the number of laws that govern things like subatomic particles, to work in such a regular way that make up everything in the universe. I can do this with my hand. I'm just a cloud of molecules. You know that. And that's all I am. But these laws come together, and they seem so purposeful. And in this preface, the person wrote, you're going to think that this is purposeful and there's a creative mind behind it, but you must fight against that urge. This is what the author was saying. To which I asked at the time, must we? Do we have to fight against the idea that all the complexity and order in the universe points to a mind rather than an accident? Think of how many blind accidents of a universe that itself is an accident had to come together to enable even me to exist and somehow communicate the fact to you through a complex code such as language. We take these things for granted. The odds of these things developing by themselves are impossibly high. So David here is looking at the sky. He's never heard of a cell. Right? Now, cells that make up my body, all little molecules coming together, individual cells are like individual cities. They have little trucks moving energy back and forth inside them. They have centers of disease control. They're incredibly complicated. They have my DNA inside my cells. Now, each one of them is a code that is an extensively long code that tells the cells how to replicate and make more of me. And so again, David didn't know about those things, but he did look at the rest of the universe and said, this is not an accident. This is not an accident. And that had implications for him. Right? Look at how he talks about the sun in verses 5 and 6. It is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of its warmth. Right? Now you look at that language, it's not the language of a textbook. Right? It's not the language also of a tourist guide saying, if you look to your left, you'll see Mount Logan, the second highest peak in Canada. It's nothing like that. Right? It's not an explanation he's trying to give us. It's a celebration of a fact. Right? He's looking at creation and saying, look, you notice in his passage, the sun is in a great mood. The sun is like a champion, like a bridegroom coming out, right, to do its thing. Why? Because there's now joy in creation. Creation is not a thing anymore, right? It's created and it's not an accident. So David could look at it with joy. He wants to share that joy, knowing that the Creator is at work, right? Now you can give data that's vast about the sun, how its dimensions, the energy, the power, and that's all very interesting. It really is. But if the sun is made, let's take our hats off to the Maker because it is, wow, amazing. Right? If there is a God, then the whole world becomes a cathedral. Right? And his incredible presence is right behind each and every one of us right now. Turn around quick. No, you don't have to, because he's in front too, and on the side. Right? God is in our presence, or rather we are in his presence. And that's part one of where David falls in love with God. He looks at creation, he says, this is the work of somebody's hands. And that person is marvelous. Right? So now the sun's immenseness is purposeful suddenly. It's beautiful. It warms the whole earth. Right? And David is using this as a metaphor, of course. And what is he saying? God's care for the entire world. Nothing escapes his notice. Nothing is forgotten. His care and his goodness are everywhere and affect everything. Right? Even in the darkest places, where we sometimes think the sun can't reach, or the love of God has somehow missed, the most difficult and frightening circumstances are still in his reach and his active interest. But without God, nature becomes a thing that says nothing. It's like a database. It's just a series of ones and zeros, like a computer code. It's just bare facts of no use to anyone, offering no hope whatsoever, except that you know you'll have a place to be buried. Right? But there's more to life than you see under a microscope, and we all know it. The heavens give us knowledge here below. So in book 1, the book of nature, David sees plainly that there is a God. Right? That knowledge reveals something in the hearts and minds of all people everywhere. Okay, in Romans chapter 1, Paul says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Whatever culture, whatever time, whatever place a person was born in, God has given evidence not only of his existence, but of his moral character. Right? So people know that there's such a thing as right and wrong, and they know they do wrong, and they know that they sin. Now, one day on earth, going outside and wandering around, would probably be enough to convince you that there's the broken nature of every human being, right? People know there's such a thing as right and wrong. It's in their hearts, right? And we know also that there's a standard that is independent of ourselves, that is true for everyone, and that we all fail to live up to it. Now in book 2, which we're getting into now, David is going to look at the law of God. He looked at book 1, but book 2 is now talking about the nature of God, his law, right? So he says, not just the written law that he's going to look at, the Torah that he had at the time, but also the unwritten law. Because Paul, again, in Romans chapter 2 said, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have a law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. And by Gentiles, he means people who are not Jews or are not reading the Torah, right, back then. Their conscience is also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and other times even defending them. So the law of God is written on the hearts of every single person, right? But God does provide his written law, right? That was David was reading. That was David was supposed to when he became king. Do you remember what the first task of every king was? The first task of every king, take the whole law and write it out by hand. You had to make your own copy of the law. Right? And why? Because it says here, when he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of the law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees. And here's part 2 of where David falls in love with God, by hearing his word. Right? Why would a bunch of rules make you feel like you want to worship God? See, our broken nature makes us hate rules. Right? Because we feel somehow that a rule is asking us to give up something, some kind of freedom. And of course it is. Right? What are we asked to give up? Our sin. Now you look what David says about God's rules in verses 7 to 9. What are they? They're perfect, trustworthy, right, radiant, pure, and firm. Right? And what do those rules make us? Refreshed, wise, joyful, enlightened, awestruck, and righteous. So you can see why David, looking at these things he's reading, he became so enamored with the source and the giver of these things. They're a blessing, right? Let's look at the contrast with the world, though. When do you hear morality talked about in the same terms? Now you look at David, he's talking about the sun. It's a champion. It's doing all this great stuff. It's having a great time doing all these things. It's wonderful. Creation is wonderful. Now he's saying the law is wonderful too. Pure, perfect, all these great things. What does it do to you? It does all these wonderful things to you. Again, David is celebrating these facts. But when you look at the world, does the world celebrate morality? Not really. The world is not really keen on perfect, pure, right, because it looks at itself and sees it as far from perfect, pure, and right. So people invent crooked paths to get around these things, right, and enable themselves to hang on to their sin, even though it's destroying them and the whole world along with them. Right? You hear the phrase, there is no one truth. And that has deeply influenced our culture. There's actually plenty of morality floating around when you think about it, but it's all very external. People talk about morality, about Wall Street, about police brutality, about race, about environmental degradation, but our morality is always over there. It's someone else, right? It's those people that are the problem. The world's morality needs an enemy to point at, because if you don't have someone to point at, who can you blame? There's nobody left but you. And that's not something our culture wants to do. We never look at our own hearts and are challenged to look at the sin in our lives, right? Because there's darkness in there. Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, Vladimir Putin, the rest of the mighty are not the problem. They are a symptom of the problem of the people they represent. Whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, personal sin must never be addressed. So instead, culture warps the rules. But David saw the law of God was not merely a set of rules. They're a window into the heart and character of the Lord, right? What do they say, these laws? Don't hate your neighbor. Protect the weak. Be humble. Love the Lord with all your heart. Right? The life of Jesus Christ on earth was our radiant view of God himself. He actually lived these laws that we're supposed to live. He lived them right in front of us. Not like stupid Plato's Republic, where it was all theory. Never going to happen. Just a fantasy. Here Christ lives out these things and shows us the face of God. There's no time, unfortunately, to go over all these individual things in verses 7 to 9. It would take a bunch of sermons anyway. But it's good enough to say that God demands things like honesty because he's honest. David saw that everyone lies, right? And that enabled him to see the beauty of God. Imagine someone who never lies. Now, if we could all be honest all the time, especially you, no. If we could all be honest all the time, the world would be a paradise. But it's not. The testimonies of the Lord are good. The fear or awe of God is pure. Like he's totally pure. Are you pure? Is anyone around you pure? That's why no one fully trusts anyone else. What if we were? We could stand in God's presence without shame. Right? Now, Adam and Eve, when they became impure, what was the first thing they did? They went to hide. And that should tell us why we should pursue God's law and reflect on the reflection that those things are of his character. So we can't contrast the law of the Lord with the law of the world. It's no contest. Right? When you follow the law of the Lord, in other words, you act like him. Have you ever regretted, ever, I ask this to the Christians, have you ever regretted following the Lord's law? Have you ever thought of something the Lord has asked you to do, and you say, you know what, I really regret not hating my neighbor? I don't think so. Have you ever found it in your heart to truly forgive someone, or to truly experience forgiveness from another person, as opposed to a lingering anger that lasts for years? It's a great weight off your shoulders to forgive, right? And a great weight lifted off of you. That's what David's response to the law of God is. He says it's better than gold and sweeter than honey. Right? In verse 10, it is very sweet and precious to look up to God and say, I did it your way, and you were right all along. By them is your servant warned. In keeping of them, there's great reward. The law set you on a good and pleasant path and helps you avoid an evil and painful one. David lived this, right? And so have we, right? Every person here has chosen a wicked path at some part of their life and will do it again, right? We slip into sin because sin is like our default status. Right? It's almost like driving on a highway. You know, when you're driving and you're just going along and you take an exit and you realize the exit that you take every day for work, but it's Saturday. That's what it's kind of like, right? Verse 12, but who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. We say and do the wrong thing often without even thinking about it, right? It's sad, but it's true. But thankfully, the Lord knows our frailty, right? And by poring over the law, it led King David to understand his faults and learn to hate them. Now remember, he loves the Lord, and he wrote this passage as an offering to him. Right? Verse 13, keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgressions. This is a real interesting part here because David loves the Lord, and yet look at the things he did as a king. There were all kinds of great things he did, very compassionate, beautiful things. But he also saw a beautiful woman bathing on a roof and arranged to have her good and valiant husband killed in battle so he could marry her, making him a murderer and an adulterer. Those are pretty willful sins, and they ruled over him for a long time. They're premeditated sins. Right? I think it's safe to say willful sins are the worst because they're the stupidest. Right? And we all know it. If you see a sign that says danger, high voltage, and there's a fence there, the last thing you should do is put both hands on it. And that's what we do. Right? Do you ever think when you're about to commit a particular sin, at the last minute the Holy Spirit says to you, God is in the room with you right now. Has that ever happened to you? That's happened to me so many times. You're just about to do something you know is absolutely wrong, and you get that last warning, don't do it. And what do you say? Nah, 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 and you go ahead. Right? And what happens after that? You enjoy that sin, and then it becomes like the taste of moldy bread in your mouth. Because that's what sin does. It destroys. It doesn't build. When David committed these crimes, he was not blameless, innocent of great transgression. His life was turned upside down because of this. Right? He lost his kingdom for a while. He became a fugitive again. And why did God strike him so hard and not just forgive him? Because it was less loving to let his child David continue in sin than to break him and humiliate him in front of the whole world. And in the end, David thanked him. It says in Psalm 51, for I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. But how is it that David is writing about these wonderful things like the son being a bridegroom and the sweet and the law being as sweet as honey? And those are celebration statements. But there are times in his life when he's beat down by his own failings. Right? So he is worshiping the Lord in his life, and yet at the same time he's crushed by his own failings. Does that ever happen to you? And I don't need to ask. We feel that way sometimes. You feel your life is stumbling from one sin to another, and it keeps on like that. And how can you praise the Lord when you're ashamed to lift up your head and pray in the first place, even to ask forgiveness? Well, that's where part 3 of David's love for God appears. It's the third part of how he falls in love with God. The first part, the glory of God in creation. The second part, the beauty of his law. The third part, his redemption. Right? David knew his lostness when he was relying on himself, which led him off the path of being refreshed, joyful, wise, enlightened, awestruck, and righteous. Right? And here's the amazing part. It was the knowledge of his failings and the forgiveness of his Father that amazed him as much as the creation and the law. If you think God of only as a creator and lawgiver, you can get into trouble. We forget that he's a loving and joyful creator. We forget that the law is not a bunch of boring and stifling rules, but a gift of looking into God's face and seeing the reflection of a perfect and pure God. Our image of God is clouded by our own sins, and that's why it keeps us from going to the Lord with our sins. We suddenly forget he's our loving and good Father, and that Jesus is our advocate, having loved us all the way to the cross. So David's sin literally boomerangs and comes around and becomes a reason to love God even more because he forgives him and he saves him. David from Psalm 103, for as high as the heavens are from the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So we're back where we came from. We're back at verse 14. The Lord is David's rock, his fortress that's high on a cliff, that's secure, that cannot be attacked. He is his redeemer. He buys him back from sin. He redeems him like buying a slave and giving that slave his freedom. If you were a lowly slave and the greatest person in the world, the wisest, the purest, came down and tracked you down and found you and bought you and freed you, how would you feel about that person? Maybe since you had no money and could never repay them, you would write that person a song and end it by saying, may these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Remember the parable of the prodigal son? The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servant, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put the ring on his finger and the sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate, it says in the book of Luke. So that's David. That's how he got to this point. The worship comes from seeing creation, from seeing the law, and from seeing the love and forgiveness of God. But what about you and me? This personal song of David was meant to be sung in public, right, for our benefit, to build us up and to edify us. So how can we get to the same place as David? Now, he left us a map to follow in this psalm. Right? It's not by working hard and earning God's attention that we will get anywhere near him. It's by the meditation of our hearts. We too can meditate on God's creation. We can meditate on his word. You find all kinds of wonders in there. Reading and hearing the word of God, you won't regret it. We get to sing songs too, like today, even if they're written by somebody else. And through the word and worship, the glorious God who is truly worthy of our worship. Coming to church is also an excellent way to follow this map, right? This is where you get to work hard and encouraging your brothers and sisters and serving. This is the place, right? And you take it out, like Jesus says, you build it in the church and you take it to the world so that they can sing the same song as we can. Right? It's easy for us to get swamped by the cares of the world and not to make time for the Lord in our lives. But we can remember that he's truly more precious than gold and sweeter than honey in the honeycomb. God bless us. Dear Lord, I praise your name for how you show us every single day your goodness and your greatness. You're before us all the time. I pray that we can just apprehend this even though it's right in front of our eyes, Lord. It's so hard sometimes to remember. I pray, show us the things that you showed David, to change our hearts so that we want to bow down and worship. We want to write down these things and say, Lord, I want to bless you with my mouth. I want you to hear what's in my heart and just to show you how much I love you. I ask this for each of us in his name. Amen.